Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast with Kate Riga. We have, we were, if we didn't know yesterday, I think what we would be leading off with today, because kind of out of the blue, we've got another one of these big exclusives from ProPublica about the Supreme Court, but this time it's not Clarence Thomas, it's Sam Alito. And we first heard about this yesterday because Alito tried to scoop ProPublica basically by publishing his response to their questions as an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. So basically, as we later found out, and as kind of became clear in the course of when this op-ed was released yesterday, the people from ProPublica, reached out to Alito, I guess yesterday, or maybe it was the day before. I guess it would have been the day before, something like that. Said, here are our questions, and he didn't respond. And then at some point, a few hours later, or something like that, his response shows up as an op-ed, and so he is answering the questions, but also doing kind of like a pre-buttal and getting in some attacks and everything. And, if you're a civilian or if you're not like a Supreme Court justice, uh, there's nothing wrong with that, right? I've even, in my lowly status, have done something like that a few times where I just haven't responded to something, to a reporter, and I just, I got my own podium here. I just, respond in my own voice, let people hear me directly. There's nothing wrong with doing that, right? People can get their two bits in a forum of their own choosing. But we used to have something called, judicial temperament, which was a certain sense of reserve and restraint. I'm a Supreme Court justice. I'm not going to be out there, shit posting you on Twitter. I'm not going to like troll you and stuff because I'm a Supreme Court justice, right? I'm a respected elder statesman, and it was always, elder statesman. But Alito has left that in the dust a long time ago. I mean, remember he was basically like heckling Barack Obama 10 years ago or whenever that was, or I don't know if that was like 2014 or 2012. I think it was, what was it? I think, although I'm just sort of extemporizing here, I think it was when President Obama, in his State of the Union address, basically denounced Citizens United, said something, I don't know, to the effect that this is, putting money in our politics. And Alito's down there, and it's always, here's the thing. When you watch it on TV, and I have never been at a State of the Union address live, there, but I've been I have been in the gallery when kind of big stuff's happening. I mean, a few times, but I actually, years and years and years ago, before TPM, I actually covered Bill Clinton's impeachment for Salon. Okay. Sort of, I did a lot of freelancing for them. This is probably one of the reasons why I've always never been crazy about people at TPM doing too much freelancing, because never try to kid a kidder, as my dad used to say. I was working at the American Prospect, but I was doing all this freelancing for Salon because I was so sad being at the American Prospect. In any case, long story, but the point is that when the president is there talking, when you're watching on TV, it kind of looks like, wow, Sam Alito, the Supreme Court justices, they're like, they're half a stadium away. They're not. They're like 20 feet away, basically, maybe 15 feet away, right? So they're really close up. And Alito's like, no way, dude. No way. No way. You know, he's just an intemperate and peevish guy. So anyway, he responds, and he's got his own explanation why there was no reason to declare or report these gifts, and he didn't have to recuse himself from this case and that case. But the gist is, as ProPublica came out with, that back in 2008, he went on this kind of all expenses paid trip with this guy, Paul Singer, who's a big hedge fund guy and a big Republican donor. And they went up to Alaska, catching those like big, 50-pound salmon that you catch up in those rivers up in Alaska, the kind that like, you hold them in both of your arms and like a grown man can barely hold up the fish kind of thing. And don't get me wrong, that is awesome. I'm a big fisherman, right? And I'm actually a pretty good fly fisherman. So dude, I would love to go on that trip. And like if these billionaires have an extra seat that is going unused, I'm I'm available. And I would even shift my schedule to be there. And that this is basically what Alito's argument was, because the one of the big parts of the story is that it would have cost Alito about $100,000 to charter a private jet to fly up to Alaska. And his argument was, look, I was going to Alaska. I find out Paul's also going to Alaska, and he's got an extra seat. And like no one was gonna use that seat. So it was just gonna go to waste. So it was like me just like conservation, right? Avoiding, reducing my carbon footprint. That jet's already going. So I'm on that jet. So like that makes no sense, right? So you got Paul Singer and some other sort of Republican subgark is the owner of the fishing lodge up there. And the guy who puts it all together is of course Leonard Leo, right? And so it's kind of another version of the Clarence Thomas story. Although, to be fair, the Clarence Thomas story escalated a lot beyond what we seem to have with this. I mean, Clarence Thomas went on like multiple vacations with this Harlan Crow dude, to Bali, to the South Pacific, multiple times with his family, blah, 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 blah. Then it turns out that like Harlan's buying his mom's house and like putting her all sorts of stuff. So what we found out about Alito is not of the scale of Clarence Thomas, but it's the same kind of thing. And I think that the one thing is that in character for Thomas, I think we barely heard from Thomas through all of those ProPublica stories. I think he put out a statement saying, "Oh, I consulted my friends. They said this was all cool. Going forward, I'm gonna, uh, report more of these things and blah 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 blah." But again, Sam Alito is a different kind of dude, so he's out there like writing an op-ed about it and everything. But I think what you see here, and this Alito thing kind of brings it into brings the big picture together. That it's not like somehow or another this Harlan Crow guy just glommed onto Clarence Thomas. All of these guys, all of these billionaires are big Republican donors. They're also big Federalist Society donors. And the guys hooking everybody up, hooking each new justice up with their own billionaire friend, or sort of like, sponsor billionaire family, to take them on vacations and renovate their homes and all this kind of stuff, is Leonard Leo, right? It really is. I did a post about this morning. It really is almost like a sponsor family program. Like at the military academies and some very kind of structured college programs. You go there as a freshman or a cadet or a plebe or something like that, and they hook you up with a sponsor family, right? You stay there on vacation, on holidays, stay with the sponsor family, go watch a movie, take a nap, something like that, kind of a family away from home. And clearly, this is part of the routine that they have. And we everybody knows that the Federal Society has created this pipeline of appellate judges that get queued up to then be ready to get the promotion to the Supreme Court, a pipeline of these people a lot of money, a lot of internships, a lot of support and kind of you know, ideological indoctrination. Although after they got it kind of down to a science, they didn't need that much of the indoctrination. They kind of get them at the, you know, they get them as kids, and they weed out the non-ideologues, right? And just a matter of kind of keeping them in good, it's like gardening. Keep them pruned, water them, right? To make sure they're ready. And that's how, you got Amy Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh, Neil Gorsuch, all of these people. I don't know exactly Barrett's background, but Kavanaugh's dad's big like Republican lobbyist in DC, right? Gorsuch's mom was a cabinet secretary under Reagan, right? It's like intergenerational. They really do breed these guys out of like a test tube, pretty much. But what we don't focus on as much is that after they get on the court, they remain kept, taken care of. Vacations, fun stuff, right? It's a lifestyle. So we're going to talk about that today. Talk about I mean, there's a lot to talk about. We have third parties, right? And we may have a kind of conservative, non-Trump third party. We haven't really seen that yet, but it's possible. It's possible we might have like a Green Party candidate, you know, something like that on the left. But for the moment, what we have are this no labels thing run by Mark Penn and Nancy Jacobson, these two kind of forces of darkness, high rollers from DC, who are big in the global advertising holding company business. And then we've got this RFK Jr. thing, which is like really weird because, um, the first time he really came meaningfully onto my radar as a political thing was all the way back in 2004, where he was pushing these kind of numerical analyses that supposedly proved that John Kerry had actually won the 2004 presidential campaign. And it was kind of a funny thing because obviously that was a very hard fought campaign. It was a very close election, and it was a very nasty election. And there was a lot of voter suppression stuff. There was a lot of really nasty things that happened in that election. So there were a lot of Democrats who were really receptive to maybe there was some funny business that happened in like Ohio or something like that. And at the time, Robert Kennedy Jr. wasn't known as some kind of like crazy person. And, he came forward with this, and I think there was a big expose in like Rolling Stone or something. And it was a big thing, and people were receptive to it. And I remember at the time, because I kind of assumed, like, all right, I don't think he's right here, but like, I don't think this is like malevolent or something. This is whatever. But it was a sort of a foreshadowing of things to come. Then he became a big vaccine person. And if you look now, it is basically impossible to find an issue that he is not in lockstep with the Trump crew, basically. And the people who got him into the race are, Steve Bannon and all these kind of Trump people. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about our friends in among the House Republicans. Are we going to do a shutdown now? Just kind of a shutdown for no reason. So we're going to talk about all of that. But before we do, let me remind you we have this special sponsor this month for the podcast, and that sponsor is TPM, i.e., us, and the sponsor is our big TPM Journalism Fund drive, and we've been talking about this last couple episodes. We had this special episode last week where we talked about sort of the internal workings of TPM. So if you haven't done it yet, if you are a reader of the site, if you only listen to the podcast, please consider making a contribution to the journalism fund this year. It is really critical for us TPM is the entity that makes this podcast possible. So even if you don't go to the website, consider making a contribution, because that's what makes this podcast possible. And presumably you listen to the podcast because you literally are listening to the podcast. That's how you're hearing me right now. If you don't visit the site a lot, you can go to talkingpointsmemo.com. And if you go there, you'll see all sorts of promos and everything about the drive. So it'd be easy enough to find. So, Kate, sort of a long monologue intro today, but what do you make of this Alito thing?
Okay, so my two favorite details in the story are, this is my second favorite, is when he says that the seat on the private jet would have been open regardless, your conservation point, but he adds that if he had flown commercial, the marshals would have had to protect him. So really, by flying on the private jet, he was saving law enforcement time and money. So like double good guy move to fly private. And then the other the other line that I cherish and I kind of want to get crocheted on a pillow is he's describing where he stayed, and which he describes as comfortable but rustic. And then when he's talking about the food, he says, if I can recall, it was home style fare, which I like so, so much. And, goes on to say that, he can't remember if there was wine, but he's sure it wasn't $1,000 a
It was jug
bottle.
wine.
Yeah, come on.
It
This
was
is like
totally like
prison
Judge Judy
toilet
wine.
wine.
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Um, which is so, so funny. Yeah, I mean, these details are so good, and I think they are helpful because it's not like we are unaware of this stuff, right? Like Scalia died on one of these hunting trips.
Exactly,
Like
exactly.
we knew that this stuff went on and that a lot of the justices were pretty unabashed about it. It was Scalia's way of doing it is he would go to give these speeches and then
Yeah.
like tie on little right wing funded fun trips as like a sidebar to these things. But, a long, rich history with the right wing judges on the court. And I do think we're in an era now that ProPublica did spark with the Clarence Thomas series that have kind of got people interested in this again, and rightfully seeing it as less of, although just a fact of life and more of like, this is really bad. Also, Leonard Leo is involved in basically all of these stories, who has like single-handedly kind of crafted the right-wing jurisprudence of our modern age. Just kind of like a bespeckled spider in the middle of this web. So, the
Didn't
details are
didn't it
fun.
didn't it come in actually in this story that they said that Scalia had also been to this lodge?
Yes, that's right.
Right. So he's doing these things right and left.
Yep,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
And I think, whenever these come out, now we've seen the kind of reflexive right wing reaction is to be like, well, that decision was 7-2, or whatever. Like, he would not have been a swing vote. And it's a willful misunderstanding, right? Because the point here is like, I don't think anyone's arguing that if Sam Alito wasn't taken on these little cozy trips, he would vote with Sotomayor, right? Like, no one's saying that. He's obviously an ideologue. But the whole point of this ethics system, right, is like system in quotes, that which there is to be like, even avoid the appearance of impropriety. And that's about the more fundamental things that these people profess to care about, which is, legitimacy of the court, legitimacy of the justices. Like, we're vesting these 9 people with enormous power. So there's, an implication that maybe people should be viewing that from a perspective of they're not bought and paid for by people who have interests before the court. Clearly, the justices both enjoy being kind of like uh, bathed in gifts from these people, and whether or not they would have been ideologically swayed by them, even that I don't think is a super compelling argument, because it's not like each of these cases is kind of down the ideological line. Like, this is the conservative position, this is the liberal position. It's not always that clear cut. And these are often the more boring minor cases because they don't fall that neatly on the spectrum. And if one of these cases, involves one of these guys' business entanglements. It's not at all a reach to see them, going to dinner with Mr. and Mrs. Alito and being like, "Oh man, like my life is really being dragged through hell with this regulation, blah 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 blah." And it's like, and the whole point is so you don't even contemplate that possibility, right? They're so above the fray, and now it's just like it's constant evidence that they are not above the fray, and that we've talked on the show before, but the gatekeeping of the court as this sacred, pious, like, above the normal politics body. It's always been bullshit, and that's always been a really convenient way to kind of protect the court from the very accurate critiques that they're working, out of a partisan interest.
Well, what it's also reminiscent of, and you've seen this in the classified documents case with Trump, that what Republicans have sort of, the defensive position they have found, the sort of the rampart they're crowding behind, is saying, dude, you don't even have any evidence he sold them. So what's the problem? And again, that's not the standard.
Right.
You can't just like steal them, and unless you actually went to some like foreign head of state and wrote up a contract and sold them, then it's kind of just no harm, no foul. That's obviously absurd. That's not how any of this stuff works. And as you say, these are ideologues. It's not gonna, it's not like if he hadn't gone on this trip, he's going to be like a big pro-choice dude or something like that. We all know that. But that's not the standard. You need to disclose this stuff, and just because that's what you need to do, and it is the law, or is the ethics regulation, or if for some reason, by some technicality, it's not, it should be. But one of the tertiary reasons you have this is that if every other case you're like, oh, I've got to recuse myself again because I that time I spent 6 months on Fred's yacht, sailing around, the Cape of Good Hope. I guess that's, if you're doing that constantly, people are going to say like, dude, you get how much free stuff do you get?
Yeah.
Like what's going on here? And I think, look, I think we know why they don't want to disclose this stuff, because they feel like it's not anybody's business. And I think most people, everybody wants like some privacy about what you do on your own private time, and so on and so forth. But obviously a little different here, because again, you have the Leonard Leo Federalist Society billionaire sponsor family program, and they take you on these trips. And as we said, like Scalia did this nonstop, and Scalia seems to have done what many kind of executive types, or maybe not executive types, in not cushy jobs, but jobs that allow for this, that your job, part of your job is you go to conferences sometimes, and you go to the conference and you schedule it with when some event is happening, and it's kind of a vacation on the on someone else's dime. And Scalia was clearly very good at this. Hey, we're gonna go hunting for elk at your estate. Sure, I'm sure is there any local college nearby where I can give a talk? And if you look at what Scalia said, I'm sorry, if you look at what Alito said, I'm not sure how he his exact words, but he basically said something to the effect, this is the only time I, got a freebie like this, not associated with a kind of a conference, which I think, that's where it tells us that he's usually better at kind of like combining it with some speech or event. But this is out in the wilds of Alaska, and so he couldn't find one. And this is probably why why ProPublica zeroed in on this example, because it's just a little less, it's less of a straight shot if he said, hey, I was going to this conference at Harvard, and now you're busting my chops because I stayed on Martha's Vineyard or something like that. Where else was I supposed to stay? So there you are.
It's also the kind of thing that the Supreme Court justices are basically untouchable, as we saw most recently in the round of congressional Democrats getting mad about it, and Durbin, writing a letter saying we want Thomas or one of the other justices to come in, and Roberts saying no. Um, but it is kind of nice to, at the very least, see some of this embarrassing, dirty laundry put out in public, where based on the peevishness of Alito's op ed, he's like pretty pissed about it. So it's, a small comfort that we can take.
Yeah. And if you remember that the sort of the just the dynamite moment in this whole long saga is when there were some Democrats saying, well, look, we should tighten up the ethics rules, or we should at least mandate that the Supreme Court comes up with some official ethics guidelines. And Roberts had that response of like, well, the court has never considered whether Congress is allowed to do that because of separation of powers. You're sort of like, dude, like you guys need to be like reined in a bit, because you really think you are beyond anything. It's pretty wild.
There's also a conflation that's been happening in nearly all of the reporting about this, that says that all of the justices signed off on the Roberts letter, and that's not true. All
Hmm.
of the justices signed off on the articulation of the ethics pledge that the justices are supposed to take. They did not all sign off on his thing. Yeah, his separation of powers threat, his thinly veiled "you can't touch us" thing.
Right. Interesting. I didn't know that. I didn't
So,
know
I
that.
mean, small again. The power over the court seems quite small, or differently articulated, would require kind of unprecedented aggression that we know a split Congress is not going to have, and that honestly even the unified control Democratic Congress of last term didn't have. But anyway, interesting kind of dividing lines there. So we're now going to talk about kind of the biggest specter that has been keeping Democrats up at night, which is this no labels third party candidate threat that's lurking in the background, and it's most often been tied to Joe Manchin, um, in some part because he was on a call with them where he kind of ended the conference call and sounded very candidate-y in the call, and also because every time he's asked about this, he just says, whatever I run for, I'm going to win. Also because he is up in 2024, he's running against Jim Justice, who's basically, the best person to take him on, the quite popular former governor. Um, Even though there have been some like interesting pieces there, including some other people who might run or who are running who could kind of change the calculus of the race. But this is the basic premise here, is that right now no labels is kind of being like coy, because they keep saying, we're not here to be a spoiler, we're only here to support a candidate that could actually win, which obviously no candidate can actually win on a third party bid. But so far they're just in the kind of trying to secure ballot spots state, which they've already successfully done in Arizona, Colorado, Oregon, and Alaska, and then next on the list was Florida, North Carolina, and Nevada. E.g., swing states, nearly all that they're aiming for. And then
Well, and some more than others, like Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina. Those are the biggies.
right.
Those are the ones that those matter.
And so the Democratic agita is coming from the place of, it is, I think, widely believed, though there are some people who push back on this, that 2016 went to Trump at least in part because of the presence of third party candidates. Um, the thinking from the people in that camp is that Jill Stein kind of siphoned off votes from Hillary and that swung it to Trump. The people who say that that has been a bit overblown counter that Gary Johnson siphoned some votes from Trump. So it's not completely clear that the third party dynamic helped Trump. But either way, I think it's a bit more clear cut this time, because right now the polling has been pretty consistent that people are not super psyched about another Biden Trump matchup, and that has been borne out. There's there's all the people that, it's boring, we've already seen it, they're both old, blah blah blah. But those polls also show nearly every time that those kind of like double haters, the people who don't like either, are overwhelmingly say that they'll swing to Biden if that's the matchup. Even if they're not excited, they don't like Trump enough that they would still unenthusiastically vote for Biden. And then the situation is if there was another person, maybe those double haters would go to that person instead, which would then hurt Biden a lot more than it would hurt Trump. And since Trump has never gotten to 47% in the vote, any additional factors that mean he doesn't have to surpass 50 to win, that helps him. So that's the situation we're looking at now. And I think the another thing that's making people alarmed about this is that No Labels is taking in a lot of money, between like 70 and $100 million based on varying reports. Um, and that, you know, which with all of these factors combined, that they could be a threat and that they could throw the election to Trump, which at this, still early stage is looking pretty good for Biden, right? Because Biden has surprised a lot of people with the progressiveness of his governing in his first term so far. This is Trump post loss, indictment, 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 which, as much as the right wing pretends, those things are not good for a candidacy. So it's like the most juiced Trump we've ever seen. And it'll be a Trump who's going to go through a bruising primary in one way or another. Even if DeSantis's attacks are not the most powerful up till this point. Now you've got Christie in there, who, like, the whole point of this is to kind of vent his spleen on Trump. So all of those factors kind of make this matchup seem pretty good for Biden, especially now that we have avoided debt ceiling catastrophe. So the economy seems like it'll be in a pretty good place. And then the third labels threat is seen as the thing that could kind of disrupt that and potentially give Trump an edge in an election where so far he seems pretty edgeless.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think what's important. I mean, first of all, I think the money is almost the whole thing, because if these two randos, Mark Penn and Nancy Jacobson, like, want to, like, run, okay, whatever, like, there's lots of sort of phantom parties that are on the ballot in a lot of places, but you put $100 million behind it, that matters. And what we have to remember here is, I mean, obviously everybody knows that this third party candidate isn't going to win, but what we're talking about here is, remember, Wisconsin, Nevada, uh, less so Michigan, but Arizona, Georgia. You've got a lot of states where you're talking about really razor thin margins. So all you need is for a third party candidate to come in and get like 1% of the vote, and that could easily move these states into the other column. So it's when we're talking about, our recent elections tend not to be that close in terms of the popular vote, as we know. Although, you know 47-51 or 52, or that's still pretty close by historical margins, but they're often, as we know, very close in the electoral college, or not the electoral college precisely, but very close in key states that make up the electoral college, all of that kind of stuff. So even a flailing effort that just gets very marginal support, 0.5%, could easily turn the course of the election. And it's and I don't think the third labels thing will be the last of it. I suspect that Robert Kennedy Jr. will also run in the general election. There's some issues. You have some states have sore loser laws. You can't run in the primaries, then run in the general, and all that kind of stuff. But again, not all states have that, and you only need to be operating in a few states. And if they don't use Robert Kennedy, they'll find someone else, another kind of like ban and puppet. So, and I think what's important here, it's not like, oh, all hope is lost and everything. It's more that I think we're seeing the contours of what this election is going to be about. That a huge part of the outcome is going to be determined in advance by whether you have well funded or well covered third party um, uh, stooge candidates. And it's possible you could have a non-stooge candidate who does the same thing. And I only distinguish between those two because, look, there are people on the sort of the far left or the far right who they want to run themselves, libertarian, green, whatever. I think it is extremely unwise, and personally I don't see how anybody anywhere on the left can understand that if the option is Trump. But that is at least a little different from Steve Bannon running a candidate in the Democratic primaries. Who doesn't understand that? But you got Cornel West, who and like I've when I was much younger, I met him a number of times, and he's a very interesting guy, but he has become a very destructive force in our politics. Very destructive. And he's a really interesting, smart guy, and I don't say this likely, but he's someone who's really kind of fallen in love with the sound of his own voice. There's kind of no other way to put it. So it's a problem.
And interestingly, at least the Democrats in the Problem Solvers Caucus, which we have made much fun of on this show, but is kind of the legislative body that's explicitly aligned with no labels, are kind of coming out against this loudly. One of them, Brad Schneider, who's a Democrat from Illinois, said, "I can think of nothing worse than another Trump presidency and no better way of helping him than running a third party candidate." So the way I come at it is I think it's obviously something to be concerned about. And the more you get this stuff in the open and people are talking about it, the less effective it will be as kind of this like sneak attack meant to lure in low information voters. I also read kind of a compelling take from an academic who kind of studies elections, who was writing about that third party candidates tend to do the best when the election is seen as a near certainty for one of the candidates,
Yeah.
and when a protest vote won't really matter, or when the policy differences is not like a huge gulf between the two. And I think it's pretty safe to say that come 2024, if it is as we expect, a Biden v. Trump matchup, neither of those lenses, fit on this situation. People by this point know who Trump is and how destructive and dangerous he is, which is reflected in the polling. I think that's why so many people who are unenthusiastic are saying, like, I'm not going to be stoked, but I will still vote for Biden ultimately.
Yeah, no, I think that is, as you said at the end there, I think whoever that academic is basically right. But another way to put that is, in 2016, people can say, well, he's kind of bombastic, but we know Trump from that show, and how bad can it be, and all that kind of stuff. And I think the people who thought what I'm about to say, are foolish, but many did, kind of like, how big a difference would there be?
Mm-hmm.
Hillary and Trump. And as you say, at this point, I don't think anybody is thinking like, oh, Trump, how bad can it be? Like,
Right.
dude, it can be really fucking bad. And I think we all understand that. Like, either you are for Trump or you are scared shitless about Trump. There's like there's kind of no middle ground. So I do think that, there's a reason there was not a significant third party vote in 2020,
Exactly.
because everybody got that everything was on the line. So I think there is that positive side. So as you say, it's not like all hope is lost. It's just a matter of seeing clearly that is one of the fundamental dynamics of the outcome in 2024.
Mm-hmm. And plus 2016, basically everyone thought Hillary was going to win until the election. So, again, I think
Unrealistically in some ways,
totally. But
by for a lot of reasons. But yes, absolutely, no one thought Trump could
Right. So,
to
I mean,
win.
if you're gonna cast your protest vote, right? Like, I mean, it seems lower stakes when everyone thought that she was gonna win. And I think again, a contributor to why 2020 did not have that because everyone was disproved of that notion pretty aggressively. Um, and I also think I don't know, Manchin's role here is interesting, right? Because I think part of the reason why it keeps, like, lurking as a concern, I think you're totally right, it's mostly the money, but also, Manchin put out some or he when he was asked about this, like, he's been asked about it a lot by this point, but he said something like, "I have no interest in being a spoiler," or something, which, had we not lived through the last 3 years with him, I honestly think people would take as a comfort, If we remember at the beginning of the last congressional term, people kept asking him about, what about this part of the Biden agenda and this part? And he said, I am not going to make Joe Biden an unsuccessful president. And I remember that so clearly because when I saw that, I was like, oh, okay. So
It's in the bag. It's
he's
good.
not going to be a huge
Yeah,
issue, right? He's going to kind of make a stand on the few things he has to make a stand on, but if he wants Biden to be a successful president, then he's going to go along with the agenda. And then look what those 2 years were, a constant battle. And I think correctly,
although in fairness, at the end of the day,
that's
it
what I was going to
wasn't it
say.
wasn't it wasn't the whole thing, but he did make possible what we now see as the centerpiece of Biden's agenda, the
He came
Inflation Reduction
through
Act.
in nearly every way, as agonizing as it was. But I think back then and when he said that, people were having illusions of an even grander agenda, that maybe an even
Absolutely,
more
absolutely.
progressive slate would be
Yep,
possible.
yep.
So now when he says he doesn't wanna be a spoiler, you're kind of like, "Well, okay, man who cried wolf," like, it's kinda hard to take you at your word at this point because clearly what you saw as not being a thorn in the side of successful President Joe Biden did not match what everybody else sees as that. So, who knows what your definition of not a spoiler is, right?
Well, especially because, I mean, look, there is no scenario in this universe in which that candidate is not a spoiler. Now, they may not throw the election in a way that you care about if you're a Biden supporter, but there is no way in this universe that person not only any way they win the election, there's no way they win any state. Right? I mean, so from the beginning, it is he's not leveling with anybody since clearly the only possible scenario is that person is a spoiler. And in the nature of things, just with the way third party dynamics work and all that kind of stuff, you don't know what the outcome of your spoiling is. Maybe everything turns out okay. Maybe you throw it one way. Maybe you throw it the other way. I mean, I think it is much more likely it hurts Biden, but it's not impossible that it plays out in a couple states in a way that somehow knocks a sure thing state out for Trump. So you don't really know, but the whole thing is ridiculous. And I think, look, it's not that. To me, what makes me relatively confident, or I'm not even sure I would say confident, makes me think that he will not be part of this is that I don't think he wants to end his career not only losing by such an immense margin, but becoming just like a a sort of object of contempt and ridicule because he's a player, right? He is someone who everybody in Washington had to watch his every statement. He's the person who said, okay, now the Inflation Reduction, what we now call the Inflation Reduction Act, can pass. Now, when I say, kind of like being the big dude, like people saying, is he more powerful than Biden? Someone like that doesn't want to end their career saying like, oh, I might break 1% in Alaska. It's like Connor Roy, right? For people who watch Succession, or frankly, who the Connor Roy here is Robert Kennedy Jr., right? I mean, he is the Connor Roy, Connor Kennedy. I mean, but again, I don't think Joe Manchin wants to wants to finish up that way. I suspect he runs for Senate, and I don't rule out that he can win. He's yes, the polls look pretty bad for him, but now you said before about how they're how some other people might run in the primary, I guess the Republican primary in
Mhm.
West Virginia. I assume what the issue is there is that, and for those of you who don't kind of um, have a sense of West Virginia politics, and I don't have a lot of sense of West Virginia politics, but when he first ran for governor, Jim Justice was Democrat.
Mhm.
So he's not a hardcore conservative. Obviously, when you switch parties, you kind of like suddenly you're like, Joe QAnon and stuff. So he's pretty conservative, but I'm sure there are a lot of Republicans in the state and a lot of hardcore conservatives like, dude, I've been waiting. Like, we're not gonna just give this to you. Kind of anybody can beat Joe Manchin, or at least they think that. So who knows? He could win there. I just don't think he wants to. I don't think he wants to end his career um, that way, and I take some confidence from that.
So the factors I was talking about in West Virginia are you've got Alex Mooney, who is in the House of Representatives, and he's like one of the Trumpiest congressmen there is. He is looking to run, and he is so far backed by the Club for Growth, which is like has a lot of resources at its disposal. So if he could somehow win the nomination or really beat up Jim Justice by reminding everyone that he was a Democrat and kind of using that as a cudgel, I think that's kind of an X factor in the situation. And then also you have Don Blankenship, who just took out some ad buys on the various networks. Um, so the thinking there is like if he ran as an independent, he would probably leech off some Republican votes. And if you could split that,
Wait,
Manchin
is
would eke
isn't
through.
isn't he the mine owner who's been like indicted and like said McConnell's like cocaine Mitch, or am I thinking
Yeah,
of the wrong
that's
guy?
right.
Okay, okay,
That's
right,
right.
right, 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 right.
Um, yeah. So
So it's a pretty feral place.
right. And I think all of those factors, whether or not they would ultimately be enough for Manchin to win what is like undoubtedly a huge uphill climb, if there was enough hope that he could win, I think that he would stay in the race because there really isn't any other like natural offshoot for him right now. And in terms of doing the no labels thing, it's like I get it. You don't want to put anything past him at this point, but people who kind of run in these I know I'm not going to win, but I want to be in the race roles, like often do it because they want their issues to get talked about, right? Or they want, or think of kind of like Bernie running in the primaries. And that's one that had a really tangible effect, right? Like his and Warren's stuff forced the more, Biden, the more centristy people to like talk about universal health care and really did like kind of change the Democratic agenda. And I'm not saying everyone who runs is that serious or that like ideological, but Manchin is ideological. Like he has no policy convictions whatsoever. So it's like, when you ask like why are you getting into this race? I mean, he's going to say some bullshit about like, well, I want to bring like civility back to Washington, which is like terrific,
No, his big thing is like his ideology is going on the Sunday shows. Basically, that is
yeah,
his ideology,
exactly.
and like whining,
And
and like
like
great. I
protecting
don't want to
his
say
coal
anything mean about
fortunes.
Manchin because we don't want you to do anything bad. So we're not criticizing Joe Manchin, and the people who I know who are friends of Joe Manchin. I'm not criticizing. It's all good. We love Joe Manchin, but I will say this, that the thing to keep in mind is that if he has any hope of winning a Senate reelection in West Virginia, he has to spend the next 18 months crapping on Democrats at every opportunity. He has to be saying how Joe Biden sucks. Joe Biden turned out to be a total AOC, liberal, Marxist, crazy person. Joe Biden blows and all this kind of stuff because he needs to get in that posture in West Virginia. So I mean, again, if you're everything that pisses you off is probably not you, Kate, but you, um, is exactly what he needs to do if he's going to have any shot of getting reelected. And you got to hope he gets reelected because it is virtually it is very hard to see how it's possible, but it's pretty hard to see how Democrats hold on to the Senate if they don't hold on to that
Yeah.
seat.
Okay, so now let's transition to our last topic of the day, which is kind of what exactly is going on in Congress post the debt ceiling bill, because now law, because I'm sure, as many of our listeners, I'm sure, noticed the kind of celebrating that we averted the debt ceiling time was extremely short before we got into and now we're facing a government shutdown kind of alarm pieces coming from all corners. And it was funny because reporting this one was like, it's really complicated. And in a lot of pieces I read, people just kind of like wrote around the complicated parts, which I understand because it was honestly kind of a heavy lift. But the situation we're basically facing is this, which is the debt ceiling law passes, the one that was brokered by Kevin McCarthy and Joe Biden. And within that bill were parameters on the spending for the appropriations process, which are normally two totally separate things. We have to raise or suspend the debt ceiling sometimes so the US can pay back its debts. And every year, Congress has to pass budgets to keep the federal government operating. Those are different. And if we hadn't done the debt default or the debt ceiling, we would have defaulted, which would have been historic, calamitous, et cetera, et cetera. If you don't fund the government in time, we have government shutdowns, which all of us have lived through before. They tend to be like a few days to a week long, way less damaging. I mean, embarrassing, and some federal workers like don't know if they have work for a time, and national parks close, and no one's saying it's great, but it does not compare to default. And the reason the two things are linked, because in that debt ceiling law, McCarthy and Biden agreed to spending levels for the appropriations process, which everyone thought was going to make the appropriations process like 800 times smoother than usual, because we'd already agreed what we were going to spend, which is one of the biggest points of contention between Republicans and Democrats. However, after the debt ceiling law passed, the far right flank of the House caucus went into open revolt, and they started shutting down the floor, blocking their own bills, all because they were pissed at McCarthy for striking this deal with Biden. So McCarthy said in response, okay, fine, we can write our spending bills way below the levels that I agreed to with Biden. Essentially, we can renege on the deal that we just made days ago, and write down to like fiscal year 2022 levels, which is way below what they agreed to. Democrats get really pissed, right? Because they're like, we just made this deal and you're walking away from it. And now we're in a situation where so far, the Senate appropriators, the leads who are Patty Murray and Susan Collins, are just kind of ignoring that revolt and writing to the details in the debt ceiling law, which is kind of leaving the House Republicans on an island right now. Because a lot of Senate Republicans, too, are not jazzed about the revolt, partially because there is a punishment written into the debt ceiling law, which technically it starts with a January 1st deadline. If they don't pass the appropriations package or a continuing resolution, which is a spending bill that just keeps the spending levels like flat while they keep haggling the details. If they don't do it by January 1st, asterisk, this is only enforced on April 30th. So it doesn't really kick in till then. But the punishment is that everything reverts back to 2023 levels with a 1% cut, which would be, as we talked about last week, a big cut for defense spending. And that's supposed to be the stick that keeps Republicans at the table. And Senate Republicans are like, yeah, we don't want to do that. Like, that doesn't sound good. So it's a pressure to kind of keep everyone working within the parameters of the deal, because if everything falls apart, that's the punishment that's built in. So that's kind of where we're at right now, and which is why the shutdown risk is heightened, because even if House Republicans are out there by themselves, if all House Republicans kind of band together and refuse to pass the spending bills that are written at the levels outlined in the deal, that will shut down the government. And the two kind of pressure points where the shutdown happens is October 1st, which is the new fiscal year when they have to pass this stuff by, but they can just pass a continuing resolution there to kind of avert that deadline without any punishment. So that's probably what they'll do. And then January 1st is the next time that a shutdown could happen.
Okay, so I guess the key point is that 3% defense cut in defense spending
Mhm.
cudgel remains in effect kind of regardless of what House Republicans do, right? So that cudgel is still there, right? They
Mhm.
can't really, and I guess they would say, well, we're not going outside of the agreement. The agreement, the agreement didn't say we have to spend at X levels. It just said there's this punishment if we don't spend at X levels. And I guess um, my confidence here is that there are lots of Senate Republicans who see a non-real dollars cut, a kind of a top line nominal cut of 3% to defense as absolutely unacceptable.
Mhm.
Like they see the current deal basically puts into effect Biden's increase. By what Biden proposed, which is, I guess, like a 1% increase, which is it 1% in an inflationary period is in effect a cut in real dollars. They would argue, or not argue. I mean, it is. Although inflation works a little differently, and the defense spending is not really quite the real economy. In any case, I don't think they will. There's just no way Senate Republicans are going to go along with like, oh, I guess we have to have a 3% cut in defense spending. So I think that and as you say, I mean, I guess you can have a shutdown if then maybe there's going to be a shutdown. Well, everybody's kind of figuring out what to do, but I just don't think they can. There's just no way they can make their their wish list cuts work. I mean, that's why it was a good deal.
Right.
They seem to have missed that there could also be a shutdown, but they put teeth in this in a way that these guys can't get around. And I assume what McCarthy's thinking is that I need to kind of stabilize the situation in my caucus, but like, okay, you can do a kind of a LARPing like appropriations bills, and we'll hit the buzzsaw at the end of the year and kind of whatever. It's no skin off his back to allow them to do that, and in a sense, it kind of is no skin off his back. They can go through the motions. So, but yeah, I guess you could have like a couple shutdowns, but like whatever. I'm not even sure. We're past the point of what is good government and what is ideal. We're trying to make it through to 2024 and make sure Donald Trump doesn't become president again. That's the big deal.
Yeah. And I think partially it's like there are so many months before we kind of hit the serious sequestration punishment written in that debt ceiling law. That doesn't kick in until April 30th. That to some degree it might be a matter of like let them get get the steam out now, like write budgets that give $5 to the education department, like sure, kind of do that. As you say, a shutdown, especially compared to the debt ceiling, which an awful lot of Republicans were kind of at least
Happy to do that too.
on its
Yeah.
face happy to do that. This is like, one person described it to me as like if they were willing to shoot themselves in the head, why wouldn't they shoot themselves in the foot, right? It's just kind of like the shutdown seems like very possible and also just relatively fine. I mean, it's going to be on House Republicans then to sell the argument we had to shut down the government because it was so important to us to renege from the deal we just made 4 months ago, and that McCarthy was all over the place like bragging about what a great deal it was. So yeah, that's kind of the situation. And I think the ultimate or the biggest point here is like having House Republicans be siloed off already at this early date, having Senate Republicans not even being willing to be like, well, let's wait and see what they produce, but kind of already being like, like, no, we don't want to endanger defense spending like that. I think just furthers the narrative that House Republicans are kind of unserious and just auditioning for Fox News at all times. And then, on a parallel track, we have now Lauren Boebert is going to force the House to vote on impeaching Biden, which McCarthy is like really mad about. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, who like backs the effort, is also saying that accusing Boebert of being a quote copycat because she filed impeachment articles first. So it all contributes to this thing of like House Republicans are fundamentally unserious, like not negotiation partners, not someone you have to take particularly seriously. And if they kind of keep to this tack with the appropriations process, they're just going to be written out, right? They're just not going to be part of it. You're going to let the big kids figure out the spending levels, and then it'll be up to McCarthy to get as many kind of normal Republicans on board as possible, and then just let, Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert kind of hold a press conference in the parking lot or whatever.
Now, do you have a sense of, either from just being up there in the Hill or in other reports, what does the sort of the 150 non-Freedom Caucus Republicans, how are they feeling about this? Because I think one of our takeaways from the deal that was, the Biden McCarthy deal, which, broadly those 150 or so voted for, was they were thinking like, yeah, we don't want to live, we don't want to be ruled by these idiots. And with, there's a lot of people, there are a pretty substantial number of House Republicans that are in, maybe not districts they're going to lose, but that they can't, that it's not a sure thing. They don't want to make their reelection harder. They don't want to go through all this. And I'm thinking now about this Boebert impeachment thing. The reason they're so pissed is obvious. That is, if you're a Republican and you get a chance to vote on impeaching Joe Biden, and you say, no, I don't want to impeach Joe Biden, that becomes like you're full rhino, right? But on the other hand, that's not part of Kevin McCarthy's plan right now to have a summer impeachment trial, because Lauren Boebert sort of forced this chain of events that maybe they can't get out of under. So I'm I'm very curious where that group is going to figure in as this stuff unfolds.
I mean, as of now, they're going to be taking their cues from leadership, right? And right now, McCarthy is saying those spending levels that we agreed to are a ceiling, not a floor. We can go under them. The head House appropriator for the Republicans, Kay Granger, is kind of saying the same thing. But again, it's so low stakes right now. I mean, in congressional time, we're like a century out from when this stuff matters, that I just think broadly there's not a lot to lose from people just kind of like letting it happen for now. It lets the House Freedom people like crow around about how like they've gotten a win for once, and it even lets the more kind of run of the mill Republicans be like, well, we're serious about rating and spending, blah, 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 like austerity, whatever. And then it's just like, okay, fine. As one person said to me, sometimes in a new Congress, people feel like they have to have the fight and lose it, and then they kind of go back to normal governing. And I think that's the period we're in right now.
Yeah, I mean, and that makes sense for all the reasons that we described. That you kind of do your LARPing budget now, and you get it out of your system, and then maybe you have a shutdown to kind of show you're not like a rhino, and then everything kind of ends up like we thought
Right.
with the deal. And again, I think the key point for listeners is that they negotiated a deal that has serious teeth in it, and things that Republican, at least Senate Republicans, frankly a lot of House Republicans, kind of all but some of the really out there ones, that's what they care about. They don't want big defense cuts, and so it has teeth, and I don't think any of this stuff's going to happen. It might be a little bumpy, but I think the deal was a good deal because it had strong enforcement mechanisms.
Yep. Agree.
Okay, so I guess that is I guess that's it for today's episode. I want to remind you the sponsor of this episode is our drive for the TPM Journalism Fund. So if you haven't contributed yet, please give it a thought to make today the day, or whatever day you are listening to this podcast. If you're only a podcast listener and don't come to the site often, still a good reason to contribute, because TPM is what makes this podcast possible. So go to the site, talkingpointsmemo.com. And if you do, you'll see all sorts of promos and everything. It'll be really clear where to do it. And I guess that is it for today's episode.
All right. See you next week.
Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.